Hello and welcome to the Kings Weekly Podcast. I'm your co-host, Nick Agar Johnson, editor-in-chief and staff writer for No Ceilings NBA. We are part of the Basketball Intelligence Podcast Network, the Old Man Squad Podcast Network, and the Believe Network. And I'm here, as always, with my co-host, founder and curator of the Basketball Intelligence newsletter, available at basketballintelligence.net, Ray LeBeau. Hello there, Ray.
Hi, Nick, and welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today.
So today we are going to do a special exercise which may surprise those of you who know Ray and I from our work outside of this podcast, that Ray was actually the one who suggested this, not me. So we are going to be talking today about some hope for the future for the Kings. And the biggest area to talk about hope for the future with the Kings is their upcoming pick, which will presumably be near or at the top of the 2026 NBA draft. So Ray compiled some mock drafts for us to talk through some of the prospects, where they ended up, how they might potentially fit with the Kings. And I have rambled long enough. So Ray, take it away.
Just to give a little bit more background about this. So this is a time of year where people start getting serious about doing mock drafts. And of course, they get more and more and more serious as we get closer to draft time. And so I did a scan of on the web to see which of the really solid draft experts have posted mock drafts. And the goal was to see where they mocked the Kings and who they selected at that mock position. And for the most part, the way they went about it was to use Tankathon or some other draft simulator to assign a position in the draft to the Kings. And needless to say, I'll say it anyway, it's almost every one of them was near the very top of the draft, because unless you've been Rip Van Winkle, you know where the Kings are and where they're likely to wind up. And of course, aberrational things happen, like Dallas with a 1.8% chance of finishing first in the lottery, But in theory, at least, the lottery should closely reflect teams' records. And so that's how those numbers came to be. And so when each of those experts got the simulation for where the Kings would finish, that's where they picked who the Kings ought to pick or might pick at that number. And so we've done 8 of them. And I guess we've done 8. It resulted in 8 different players being picked. Several of them were picked by multiple of the experts at the same or different positions in the mock draft. So that's how we got to where we are, and that's what we're going to be doing today. And Nick, as the draft expert, is going to tell us about each of the players who were mocked. I'll tell you where they were mocked and by whom. And Nick will discuss their strengths and weaknesses and perhaps a little bit of the fit with the Kings. I will add one other piece to this puzzle, and it's really good news. As horrible as the Kings are as a constructed team, that is a function that is not assignable to the current leadership of the Kings front office. And what we do have to go by is how they've done in talent acquisition in the draft and undrafted free agent. And wow, so far so good, right? 3 really good rookies. So that one hopes, and I believe, is a very good sign for going forward and for what's going to happen in the draft. And the last thing I'll add is that, wow, this is a great draft likelihood. One of the all-time greats in almost everyone's opinion about how this is going to turn out, with the top 3 being all-timers in all likelihood, and the rest of the draft being deep. And you never really see a draft that is that strong at the top and that deep. So yes, things can go wrong and people can be wrong about stuff, but boy, I would say it's even beyond a consensus view that this is likely to be one of the greatest drafts ever. So
Just one very, very quick clarifying point before we go on. The top of the draft is definitely the strongest top three of any draft that I've evaluated. The lottery is very strong, and there are a ton of really great guards in this class. The depth does fall off a little bit once you get outside of the top, 15, 20 or so. There's a lot less consensus outside of that group. But the good news for the Kings is that's not where they're going to be picking. So in terms of both need, right? Because the Kings very much would like to have a point guard, as opposed to just a whole bunch of combo guards. And, also there's some forward depth in this class, which we'll get to in a way that will be very beneficial to the Kings. So really, in terms of the depth, I'm not sure it'll be an all-time class depth-wise, but in terms of the all-time parts of this class, the Kings will be able to get in on the important parts of the all-time version of this class. So
absolutely true.
Not to derail us too much, but just wanted to add in that quick clarifier.
Yeah, no, it's a good point that it does drop off after a while, but that after a while is irrelevant to the Kings.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get started on discussion of the players. Caleb Wilson was mocked at number 4 by 3 of the experts: Urson Demir, MyNBADraft.com, and Jonathan Wasserman, all mocked Caleb at 4. So let's start with him.
Yeah, so the mode, for those of you who are statistically inclined, there were 3 picks for Caleb Wilson at 4 and 3 picks for AJ Dybantsa at 2. So a little bit of a spoiler alert for what's coming ahead, but the 2 most common selections were AJ at 2 and Caleb Wilson at 4, as you just mentioned. So with Caleb Wilson, we said up front, and we'll continue to say, the top 3 of this class is considered to be historic. Like, every single one of the top 3 players in this draft class would be a contender for the number 1 overall pick in pretty much any non-Wemby, non-LeBron campaign. Like, Cooper Flagg could potentially have gone 4th in this draft class. I personally would not have had him going 4th in this draft class, but that's not an unreasonable take. So Caleb Wilson being at 4 says absolutely nothing about Caleb Wilson and absolutely everything about the top 3. But the top 4 is pretty solidified at this point, and Caleb Wilson being the 4th of those 4, he's having an exceptionally impressive season. I mean, near just barely under 20 points a game and 10.5 rebounds a game for North Carolina. So it's not like he's beating up against low-level competition, right? He's playing for the bluest of blue bloods, and he's averaging 20, 10.5, 3 assists per game, a steal and a half per game, and a block and a half per game. And the place to start with Caleb Wilson is he is a sensational athlete. Like, he is, one of the things that I talk about a decent amount on the other podcast that I do, the Deep Dives podcast over on the No Ceilings NBA Draft Show, there is a big difference between guys who are, top high school players, and then they get to the college level and they just can't keep up with the jump in athleticism. And that was a potential concern for Caleb Wilson heading into the year. He was 5th in his high school class by RSCI, and, 6'10", 210-ish pounds, give or take. Ridiculous athlete. But, one of the questions that I ask myself over and over again, which Kings fans will be painfully familiar with in terms of the Thomas Robinson and Marvin Bagley III experiences, is, okay, this guy's a sensational athlete. Can he scale up to the college level and be anywhere near as dominant? Caleb Wilson has scaled up to the college level and essentially not missed a beat. He's one of the best transition players in basketball. He, just under 60% field goal percentage, but most of that is because it's driven down slightly by his 3-point percentage. He doesn't have much of a shot, which we'll get into in a moment. But I mean, the difference between Caleb Wilson and Marvin Bagley III, for those of you who will be concerned about that side of things, is Caleb Wilson is a much better defensive player. Like, he's not, your sort of shutdown type. He's not like a center level shot blocker, which I think the biggest concern with him, other than the shot, is that he's kind of a tweener, in the sense of he's got a skill set that's much more suited to be the 1-in a 4-out 1-in kind of system. He's not quite a 7-footer. right? So there is that sort of concern. But I mean, in terms of just the degree of dominance that he's displaying, I think it's not just the sort of, oh, he's a 20 and 10 guy that gets it with athleticism. So are we worried that he's going to be the next Marvin Bagley? He's so much better of a defender than that. He's also a really, really good passer for his position, which I think is a huge part of it as well. And, the ability for him to make interior passes, the ability for him to, yeah, you don't want him to be, with the ball in his hands out beyond the 3-point line necessarily. And he's also much, much better in transition than the half court, which is, a bit of a concern of if he can't get out and run, then how much value can he provide to the team? The flip side of that is he's a great cutter. He's a really good passer. He can do, other than like being a primary rim protector, he's an excellent secondary rim protector, right? And so, just thinking about him in terms of the fit with the Kings, if the Kings get him, Keegan Murray immediately goes back to his actual position of the 3 rather than the 4. And then Caleb Wilson is a fantastic fit alongside, you mentioned the rookies, both of the Kings' young bigs would be excellent fits with Caleb Wilson, because with Maxime Reynaud, you don't have to worry about the spacing element, right? Like Reynaud is not, lights out shooter from 3-point range, but he's a much more comfortable and confident shooter than Caleb Wilson at this point. And so you get a lot of rim protection help for Reynaud, which has been his biggest struggle defensively as a rookie, with just a superior level athlete who also won't be missing those interior passes, right? Like something that was a big problem for, and I'm just going to the easiest example for me to find here, but Joel Embiid earlier in his career could not pass out of the post, and that really hampered him in terms of really high turnover rates for a few years until he sort of figured that out. Caleb Wilson is a much better passer than him, to the point where I'm not anywhere near as concerned about that. Like, despite his incredibly high usage, he still has a positive assist to turnover ratio. That's not something you see often for a forward who doesn't have much of a shot, who has the ball in his hands all the time, right? That's typically a kind of player that teams can force into bad situations. Caleb Wilson is both good enough as a passer and good enough as an athlete to avoid a lot of those concerns.
Okay, well, that's the first of our good news.
No follow-ups? Man, I was hoping you'd prompt me for more here. I could keep talking about Caleb Wilson.
Well, one of the things I'm thinking about is that at some point tonight I want to go to sleep. So
okay, fair enough. Yeah,
we do need to move on. Not saying that any of your comments need to be abbreviated, but just how long we want to extend them.
Absolutely fair. If you will allow me a 15-second summary at the end, you shouldn't be thinking about fit when you're picking this high, but the good news with Caleb Wilson is he is the best candidate on the board if the Kings have the 4th pick, because the top 3 will be all gone, and he's a fantastic fit with the Kings. You might hope that he would shoot a little better. That might help things. Basically everything else you could want for a power forward, Caleb Wilson has, and has in spades.
Excellent. Okay, so the next player we want to talk about was mocked at 7 by Adam Finkelstein, and that is Darius Acuff.
Yeah, so Darius Acuff, there are a couple players that are slightly higher in this particular list that I'm about to mention, but very few people have risen up my board more than Darius Acuff this season. And the main reason for that is my biggest concern by far with the college film was, okay, but is this guy going to be willing to pass? Like first of all, he's a sensationally gifted scorer. And so, that wasn't a concern with him at the high school / AAU level. But, my concern with him really was, okay, this guy's got all the kind of scoring gifts that you could want. And, I happened to see him at Nike Hoop Summit last year as well, and he was lights out. But my question was, again, what I said before, is he going to be good enough or willing enough as a passer in that Hoop Summit game? And never judge a player by their best or their worst, or even just one game, period, right? But in that game, shot really well from everywhere, 65% from the floor, 50% from 3-point range, hit his free throws. He also had 3 assists and 3 turnovers. And so my biggest concern heading into the year was, is this guy too much of a combo guard? And the answer has been definitively no. He has been the second best passer in my mind in college basketball this season. Maybe third, maybe it's Cam Boozer and Christian Anderson ahead of him, but That's it. He has made basically every pass that you would want. He's been exceptionally unselfish in running a really weirdly constructed Arkansas team that he has gotten by far the best results of any of their guards. Oh, and by the way, have I not mentioned that in addition to the passing, he's averaging 20 points a game on 49, 41, 81 shooting splits. And, when we were talking about the depth of this class up front, the reason that I think it's fantastic for the Kings in particular is if the Kings end up in the top 3, I mean, all of those guys would be number 1 pick candidates in pretty much any draft. So that's a huge win. If they end up at 4, I would be stunned if the pick is anyone for any team other than Caleb Wilson. And there happens to be a number of different reasons why I think he would be a great fit for the Kings in specific. And now we get to the third reason, which is the point guard depth in this class. Not just the guard depth, but the point guard depth. And this is something that we've talked about with the Kings for many, many, many months, verging on years now at this point of after the De'Aaron Fox trade, the Kings had a ton of combo guards and no point guards. Darius Acuff is someone who I was worried about the point guard stuff before. He has answered every single possible question I could have had for him in terms of being a distributor, being able to, make plays for others. I mean, he's got a nearly 3-to-1 assist to turnover ratio, and he's averaging over 6 assists per game. And it's not just that he's averaging those assists. It's not just that he's limiting turnovers. It's that he's trying and making audacious passes in addition to that, right? It's not just, oh, I'm this game manager point guard type, and so I'm hitting all the easy reads. Like, no, he's got, other than being 6'2", and therefore not quite being able to see over the defense in the same way that a Cade Cunningham or a Luka Doncic or a LaMelo Ball or an insert here player can, any pass that you would want to see a 6'2" guy make, he can make. And the only reason I said he's third in the class is because Christian Anderson is another 6'2" point guard who is somehow even better as a passer. But like a couple games ago, Darius Acuff had 18 points and 13 assists against South Carolina, right? That's the kind of point guard that he can be. He's both a scoring point guard and a really, really great passer. So he at 7 is the lowest pick that the Kings ended up with in any of these mocks. And if they ended up with Darius Acuff at 7, I would be ecstatic for the Kings. And, as we'll get to, there are a couple other point guards who are on this list. And part of the remarkable depth of point guard in this class is that you can make an argument for any of these guys.
Well, moving on, Kyle Boone mocked Mikel Brown at 6.
So here's another one of those point guards that we mentioned. And it's funny because I essentially had Mikel Brown and Darius Acuff at directly opposite points on my board to start the year than I have them now. And that is almost entirely driven by how fantastic Acuff has been. There is one sort of concerning thing with Mikel Brown Jr., which is he has not been particularly efficient shooting wise. He's also been wildly inconsistent. Like, just to give you some sort of idea, and he's been hurt for a while, which unfortunately makes a whole lot of this conversation a lot more difficult. But just to give you an idea, here are his last 5 games before he went out with injury. He had 11, 3, and 2 against Eastern Michigan, 9, 5, and 7 against NJIT, which I believe is the New Jersey Institute of Technology. But the fact that I have to say I believe tells you the caliber of team. Then against Darius Acuff in Arkansas, 22, 5, and 3. His next game against Indiana, 9 and 3, and then against Memphis, 16 and 3 with a steal and a block. So, it's that and the fact that he shot 38% from the field and 27% from 3-point range. Now, I believe that he was playing through injury in the early part of the season, and that's why some of those shooting numbers in particular are lower than you would hope. The fact that he's shooting 84% from the free throw line is further evidence that I think his bad shooting numbers are much more a small sample size and playing through injury thing than an actual indicator of where he's at. But I do have to raise that concern because, that is, again, if I don't expect him to be anywhere near that kind of shooter once we, actually get to discussions of him at the next level. But if he does continue to struggle to shoot, that is a concern. Now, that being said, I had him higher than Acuff by quite a bit heading into the year because I believed in him a lot more as a passer. And he's done passing wise, basically what I would have hoped for. So, again, it's more just that I'm not particularly concerned about the shooting splits. I think that assuming he, returns relatively soon and has a healthier end of the season and better end of the season because he's healthier, I expect those shooting percentages to go up by a bit. But I mean, again, that's like I'm looking for reasons to be concerned, but in terms of, game management, in terms of making the right play as a point guard, he does that quite consistently. And I think that him calling his own number, he doesn't, I mean, again, he's got 5 assists a game, right? He's not calling his own number every shot, but I think that if he was healthier, then it would be more like, 20 points a game on 45, 35, 85, rather than 16 points a game on 38, 27. I think he's a much better shooter than he's shown. But if that doesn't correct, that would be a concern. That being said, I mean, again, just all the game management stuff you would want, he is a special talent. And if the Kings end up with him at 6, I would be quite happy. And I would maybe be slightly concerned about the shooting, but that's really, again, like, this is an exceptionally talented guard class, and any of the 3 guards that we're going to discuss, plus a couple of others, depending on your personal evaluation, any of these guys could go for any of these picks, depending on how you personally feel about these prospects. And Mikel is the lowest on my board of the guards that we're going to talk about, but that is entirely due to the guys behind him moving up rather than, him doing something egregiously wrong. I'm just bringing up the shooting because if you aren't a Mikel Brown person because of that, I understand. Again, it's just he is a special game manager, and I think that the shooting numbers will correct once he has a bit of a larger sample size of healthy games.
So moving on, we're now going to talk about one player who is in everyone's list of the top 3, whether at first, second, or third. And he's been, as you mentioned in part earlier, he's mocked at 3 for the Kings in, let's see, 1.
So he's mocked at 3 for 2 of the drafts, and he's mocked at 2 for 3 of the drafts.
3 of the drafts. So let me tell you who did that. NBA Draft Room has him at 2. Ricky O'Donnell has him at 3. No Ceilings, which the only one that really counts.
Yeah, fine.
Has him at 2. Jeremy Wu also at 2. And Benjamin Yu at 3. So he's mocked at both 2 and 3, depending on who's doing the selection and what the simulator said that the Kings are likely to wind up. So, and he's been prominently observed and mentioned and scouted for quite a few years now. At one point was everybody's pick for number 1 in the class. But now he's 1, 2, or 3, depending on who's ranking the players. So tell us about AJ.
Yeah, so I sort of mentioned that the mode was tied between AJ at 2 and Caleb Wilson at 4, but the most mocked player, because AJ was mocked at multiple spots, and everybody's mocking Caleb Wilson at 4 because he's going to be the 4th pick, right? But, the top 3, there's a lot of matter of preference for which player you're going with. And the thing with AJ is, as you mentioned, he was number 1 in the class at 15, 16, and 17, I believe. And then, their senior years, there started to be a little bit more of a conversation of whether it was Darryn Peterson or AJ at number 1 in the high school class, with Cam Boozer being pretty much universally listed as the 3rd best high school player in the class. Now, heading into the year, I had the top 3 as Darryn Peterson at 1, Cam Boozer at 2, AJ Dybantsa at 3. That is still how my board is. The gaps between those players have shrunk dramatically in my mind, in the sense of I thought that Darryn Peterson was clearly the number 1 player in this class, that Cam Boozer had an argument for it, but was pretty firmly number 2 in my mind, and AJ was the 3rd on that list, with, again, the point that we've brought up before and we'll need to continue to bring up again, that the top 3 is, any of the top 3 would have been a number 1 pick contender in the majority of drafts. Now, again, I do still have AJ on my board at number 3 at this point, but he has just continued to answer a whole lot of the questions I had as the season has gone along. And, really the biggest question that I had for AJ heading into the year was how well he can balance calling his own number versus, getting his teammates involved. And that was something because, the reason that he was the number 1 prospect at 15, 16, and 17 is he's got the kind of talent that you can't teach. He's 6'9", 210, but moves like a much smaller player. He's incredibly fluid. He's got not like Caleb Wilson level, vertical, but definitely among the top tier of even NBA athletes in terms of basically any measure of athleticism you want to look at. He's really good laterally. He's great at running up and down the floor in transition. He's got good hops. And then the question was just, for me, more than anything else, were actually 2 questions, were shot selection and defense. Shot selection is, he's been mostly quite efficient. He's had a couple of, relatively poor shooting games recently, which, his 3-point percentage being just a tick over 30%, I don't think represents who he is as a shooter. But even if it does, he's so good at getting to the rim. He's pretty much unstoppable in the mid-range. He has basically every counter that you could want to look for a player like that. And, again, he's averaging 22.5 points a game, 7 rebounds, 3.5 assists, a steal and a half per game. The defensive stuff is interesting because I was much more worried about what he would do in terms of non-athletic event defensive plays, by which I mean, like, yeah, this guy can get up and spike a shot into the 14th row, right? Like, he has that. But my question was more, what does he look like on a play-to-play basis? And the answer has been revelatory. He has shown this year that even with how special Darryn Peterson and Cam Boozer are, AJ Dybantsa has the highest ceiling of anyone in this class. Because if he can put it together on both ends of the floor, then, he's like, it's almost hard to describe the kind of player that he would be if he puts it together on both ends. Like, he's gotten, a ton of unfair comparisons over the course of his life. And unfortunately, because he's so good, he's going to continue to get those kinds of unfair comparisons. But, like, he has the physical tools to, not quite at that level, because I don't think anyone in history could quite get to that level. But in terms of being like a strong safety, shut down every kind of play, switch on to everybody kind of defender, like, he could see, I don't want to say it because it's just such a high bar to meet, but like, he could be the poor man's version of Miami Heat LeBron defensively, while also being like, not quite Kevin Durant, because he's not anywhere near as efficient, but somewhere between Kevin Durant and Paolo Banchero in terms of like, can get
Well,
to
that's a huge gap in terms of shooting.
Right. Well, that's sort of what I'm trying to weigh the scales of here. Is it's hard to come up with comparisons for honestly any of the top 4 guys, because Caleb Wilson is a better passer than you usually get with the insane athleticism, wild rebounding, 20 and 10 type guys. So like, there isn't really a 2010 guy in the NBA right now who I think works as a Caleb comparison, because most of them are centers. And, he's not, right? And with AJ, it's like, it's difficult to come up, like, I mean, any of the comparisons that I give are either going to be too lofty or too reasonable, in the sense of I'm trying to cover my bases and I go too far, right? Like, he's so much better than Ace Bailey. But if you want to think of the, that kind of size of player with that kind of shot diet, except he makes those shots a lot more. And also, he's just so much better of a defensive prospect than Ace Bailey ever was. But also, it's like, well, if I'm comparing him to Kevin Durant, that's sensationally unfair, right? And, if I compare him to someone like, he was a better shooter, but I think in terms of the kinds of shots that they got, Brandon Roy at his peak had a similar profile, but he's 4 inches shorter. And it's again, it's really difficult because, put it this way, I think that the top 3 of this class, and maybe even the top 4, if Caleb Wilson turns out as good as I think he's going to turn out, I think the top 4 of this class are going to be the guys that 5-10 years from now we're like, well, he's got a little bit of AJ Dybantsa in his game, but he's not quite the same shooter, so maybe more like a Caleb Wilson type. It was like, these guys are going to be used for these future comparisons because that's how good they are. And with AJ, the only question I had heading into the year was, is he going to care enough on the defensive end? And he hasn't been perfect on that end, but I have so much more optimism about the kind of defensive player that he can be after his first few games at, first 20 games at BYU. But compared to the high school film, I have much more confidence about his defense than I did. And, to be entirely honest, a lot of the reason that, 15 through 17-year-old AJ was the clear number 1 in the class, and then Darryn Peterson and Cam Boozer have given him competition since, is there were concerns about his effort level at the college level. And in my mind, he's answered all of them emphatically. Like, he hasn't been the most consistent, but very few young players are consistent on the defensive end, right? And so it's the kind of thing where I was much, much, much more concerned about, is he going to put in the effort versus, he has all the athletic tools, right? So that was never going to be the concern. And he's figured out a lot on the defensive end. I wouldn't rely on him as a weak side shot blocker, but that's really the only sort of knock I can give to him defensively. I mean, he's been sensational, and more than being sensational, he has answered basically all of the questions I had, other than, can he be slightly more efficient from the outside? Like, that's it. Everything else has been top notch. And in terms of his fit with the Kings, I will be fascinated to see what kinds of defensive arrangements they have, because I think in the short term, it's probably more AJ guards quicker forwards and Keegan guards bigger forwards, like musculature wise. But in the longer term, AJ's got an inch, maybe even 2 inches, depending on what the, combine results are. But AJ's bigger than Keegan. He's a much better athlete than Keegan. So it might be the kind of thing where, okay, what kinds of matchups are we dealing with tonight, right? Like, I don't like either of them on Julius Randle, but if it was, a kind of situation where it's like, hey, we're going up against Atlanta, I think that Keegan makes a lot more sense on Jalen Johnson just because he's got the bulk. But that's the kind of thing where Caleb Wilson is pretty locked as a 4. AJ is athletic enough that you can sort of swing him around. Like, if the Kings didn't have Keon, maybe, and by the time they get AJ, unfortunately, they might not have Keon, but AJ is quick enough in a way that Keegan isn't, that you can throw him on more athletic wing types and then let Keegan guard the bulkier guys. And then in the longer term, hopefully once AJ potentially bulks up, you could have it be more of a sort of Keegan's the 3, AJ's the 4 kind of deal. But I mean, the Kings would go from, what do we do defensively if Keegan's not playing, to, oh, we've got 2 serious forward defenders. And that's the case for Caleb too. It's just there's a lot less switchability than there would be with AJ and Keegan. So defensively, I think Keegan being there would help AJ reach his defensive ceiling. And then offensively, it's just going to be a question of how many of the guys who are currently taking shots for the Kings are still on the Kings by the time AJ gets there, because he's going to be an electric scorer from day one. And hopefully he'll have the ball in his hands enough and get enough shots to show that to the world. But even if he doesn't, I'm much more bullish on the defense than I was a few months ago.
So a few observations. First is, thank you for giving the treatise on that reinforces the notion that we all have that comparison definitely is the thief of joy. That was great.
Oh, well, thank you.
So thanks for doing that. AJ, if I remember correctly, was probably the first person in the class to get mega money for NIL, and it was reported at various different amounts, as much as $9 million, but sometimes a little bit less. I think it's going to be interesting that 5 years from now, people will be saying, how did you get a player like that for $9 million? They're going for $40 million now. But interesting that. But I think that raises a point, which is, and you did not mention that he's at BYU, but they've been doing things consistent with that, which means he's surrounded with other sought after players who cost not his money, but significant money. How's that worked out? The fact that, and I think that probably is more so than for most of the people we're talking about. Correct me if I'm wrong about that, but they're building because they have supporters in Utah that have bottomless pits in terms of how much money they have. They're building their team, like how everybody else in the top tier wants to, but probably hasn't caught up with them quite yet. And if that's accurate, how's that worked out?
Yeah, it's a fascinating one to kind of try to break down, because with it, it's weird because AJ is both a special case and an indication of where things are going. And what I mean by that is, so AJ Dybantsa is from Brockton, Massachusetts, but his last season of high school basketball, he played at Utah Prep Academy. And everybody knew that he was at Utah Prep Academy because he was about to go to BYU, right? And so that was the kind of thing where, is it Ryan Smith, right? I want to call him Ryan Young because I think of Brigham Young when I think of Ryan, but the owner of the Utah Jazz, who has
they may rename Brigham Young Ryan Young if he keeps up what he's doing.
They very well might, or Brigham Smith, either way. But the point being that he is clearly pouring a ton of money into this team to, going forward, try and make them the kind of top tier contender that, that they're hoping for. But the thing is that, actually in terms of the BYU team, it's AJ Dybantsa, but they really didn't bring in, like, they had Rob Wright transfer from Baylor, and, he's sort of the other player who I expect got a decent amount of money to find his way to the Brigham Young basketball team. But the second best player on the team this year has been Richie Saunders, who he's been at Brigham Young for his entire college basketball career, right? So it's not like, I think sort of the hand-wringing about this sort of thing. I mean, we've talked about this before, but, worth bringing up again, that the moment that I realized that the working relationship between you and I was going to be just fine was when we both ranted about the NCAA practices of, 2.5 years ago at this point. And thankfully, since then, the NCAA has actually been forced to allow their players to receive financial compensation for their services, which, is a huge plus from our perspective, in terms of like, hey, this is more fun to follow when we know that these guys aren't getting screwed over by the NCAA. But, it's not like Ryan Smith got AJ and Cam Boozer and Caleb Wilson, right? It's like AJ was clearly the big name guy, and Rob Wright was clearly the big name transfer. But this is not just, hey, he won everybody over overnight. And so that's why I'm curious about it, because again, with AJ, this was broadcast for years before it happened, right? It was like him going to play at Utah Prep was a clear sign that he's going to take the BYU money, and that's going to be that. And, last year with Jaeger Joman, it was a similar sort of deal where it's like, this guy is a top level prospect, and he ended up going 8th to Brooklyn, right? But, again, it's not like it was Jaeger Joman and like 7 other, top quality freshmen. So I'm curious how BYU works out, because if it's kind of a thing of there's going to be one top guy in every class who goes to BYU, and, the rest of it is relatively, as expected by college basketball standards, then that would be one thing. I'm curious to see if having both Diamond and then AJ Dybantsa go to BYU expands things from here. But again, like, the 3 best players on BYU have been AJ, a sophomore transfer, and a senior who's been there his entire college basketball career. So it's not like, oh, the Mormon money is drawing in every single one of the top 10 recruits. This is not Kentucky under John Calipari, right?
This is so early in this thing. We don't know how it's going to turn out. And
sure. Just to be clear, I mean right now, not going forward.
I understand. Yeah. But in terms of the fact that there are so many more billionaires than there's ever been in the country, and their couch change is what it will be spent on the players is going to be very interesting. I realize we're getting a little far afield from what we were talking about, but how many of them are going to be doing what Ryan is doing, and how much competition will he have, and how much will the price go up, and if whether it's federal legislation or something sets a cap, how will they choose to ignore that in terms of the cheating will be at a different level. It just won't be giving a player $100,000. You're giving him $50 million. But we'll see. We'll see how all that plays out. The other thing I wanted to ask you was one of the things that intrigued me when you were talking about his defense was that more and more we're seeing players being scouted and being recruited or being drafted by virtue of the fact that they are multi-positional defensively. And you talked a little bit about that for AJ. And how does that sort of fit in with the trend that we're seeing that is jumping people up in their draft number to the extent it used to be, oh my God, KG can guard 1 through 5. Now, if you can't guard 1 through 8, including the 3 players who aren't even on the floor, you're considered defective.
Yeah, it's a fascinating discussion. And I think really the root of it is something that I've been puzzling over for years now that I think is more relevant today than it's ever been, which is it's a lot less about getting a point guard, a shooting guard, a small forward, a power forward, and a center than it is about we need X skills on the floor. We need 3 guys who can rebound. We need 4 guys who can shoot. And ideally we would have, everybody can do everything, right? But it's like bare minimum, we need, 2, 3 guys to crash the glass. We need, 4 shooters. We need 3, again, better to have more, but, we need 3 passers. We need, 1 point of attack defender. We need 1 backline rim protector. We need, 2, preferably 3 guys who can switch across the other spots, right? Of like, okay, it's almost a zone defensification of the NBA without zone defenses actually being played, if that makes sense. Of like, there's the 1 guy at the top, that's your point of attack guy. There's your backline rim protector who, depending on the team, depending on the scheme, some teams will do drop, whatever, right? But the point being, there's 1 guy who's making sure that the rim is protected. There's 1 guy who's at the point of attack dealing with the ball handler. And then you want to have as much switchability across everybody else as possible. And so, and this is, this has been a long time discussion of, it used to be A, that tweener was seen as a negative term, but B, that it was more specifically a forward thing of like, early career Draymond Green, it was like, oh, he's got the height of a 3, but the game of a 4. And over the 10 years of my professional writing career, it has very much shifted to 4-5 is what a tweener is. It's, are you good enough as a big man to do center stuff? Or do you need to be more of a sort of, I think of that archetypically as your Donovan Clingan and your Tumani Kamara, right? Like your Zydrunas Ilgauskas and LeBron James, if you want to go back a little further, or, I know you can go back a lot farther with these things than I can, but that's sort of the idea, right? If you have 2 big men, one of them has got to be able to switch a ton, and the other of them has got to be able to guard the basket. With Caleb Wilson, my defensive concern is that he's much more big man tilted in terms of his offensive skills, right? It's like, he's your dunker spot guy. He's your rebounding maestro. He's your get the ball out in transition, and he's a good enough passer that he can make the hit ahead himself off the rebound rather than needing to find the point guard, which I think is a really underrated skill of rebounding bigs is, can you also make the hit ahead pass, right? As opposed to you need to search for your point guard because you can't make the pass yourself. That's not a Caleb Wilson problem. But the flip side of that is because his offensive skill set is so much more big man tilted, there are a lot fewer players who can be the other big alongside Caleb Wilson. Whereas with AJ Dybantsa, it's like, I hate 1 through 5 because I think there have been maybe 3 players in NBA history who can legitimately switch 1 through 5. Kevin Garnett was one of them, right? So, that was a good example to give. But, the idea being 1 through 5 is thrown around a lot more than it should be.
Sure.
But 2 through 4 is really the key one for me, because if you're a point of attack guy and you're good enough at that, teams aren't going to want you to switch that much, right? It's like the best example I can give here is actually a football analogy, which this will tell you how long it's been since I followed football, but Darrelle Revis is the shutdown corner, right? That's the kind of guy you want at the point of attack. You want someone who is going to make the ball handler's life miserable. And if you can do that at 6'5", fantastic. If you're good enough at that and you're 6'1", 6'2", that's still fine, because that's the defensive role that the team's going to want you to play. For AJ, it's like Caleb Wilson can probably do 3-4 and maybe be a small ball 5, right? And in the right lineup construction, Caleb Wilson as a small ball 5 is like one of those lineups where you think Caleb can do enough defensively, but maybe it doesn't matter because he's going to small ball 5 Caleb Wilson is an insane offense if you have any of the right pieces around him. AJ is just a lot more flexible because he's got the sort of mobility to be that genuine 2 through 4 type guy. And so, for that, I think of him as like, he's one of the more switchable, versatile defenders, because that's what I care about in terms of switching. If you can switch 2 through 5, even better. But 2 through 4 is the primary concern, especially if you're not a shot blocker, which that's probably the weakest part of AJ Dybantsa's defensive profile. And I'm fine with that, to be clear, because the fact that he's, digging in and doing the more trench related sort of defensive stuff as opposed to just blocking a ton of shots, that's more encouraging to me about his defense in the longer term. But yeah, I mean, other than the sort of water bug point guards, which I wouldn't want him to switch on anyway, he can switch on to pretty much anybody who's not, to sort of go to the other side of that analogy, of the Portland thing, right? He could switch on to everybody that isn't Donovan Clingan or Scoot Henderson.
So next up, Derek Parker mocked Kingston Flemings at 5.
So we talked about Mikel Brown and Darius Acuff earlier, who they were mocked at 6 and 7, and then now Kingston Flemings at 5. Kingston Flemings is my favorite point guard in this class. He is, we talked about the point of attack stuff before. Kingston Flemings is a absolutely absurd point of attack defender. Just to give you some idea, in his last game against Arizona State, this is the full Kingston Fleming experience right here. In his last game against Arizona State, 20 points, 4 rebounds, 8 assists, 2 blocks, 4 steals. And by the way, he did that with 20 points on 14 shots, hit all of his free throws, 1 of 3 from the 3-point line. There is nothing that I would want a point guard to do that Kingston Flemings does not do at an exceptionally high level. He's shooting 52% from the field, which includes, I don't have the updated numbers right in front of me, but last time I checked, well above average finishing at the rim. 52% from the field, 38% from 3-point range, 81% from the free throw line. He's got a 3-to-1 assist to turnover ratio. He's playing for a coach who normally doesn't like to play rookies, and that is being tested by the fact that Chris Sadak Jr., who was a much more highly touted prospect than Kingston Flemings, has had inconsistent playing time and inconsistent role, and Kingston Flemings essentially has been, he started every single game for Houston, and he's been spectacular while doing it. I mean, he's averaging 2 steals a game, and that's with before the Arizona State game, he had somehow had 3 straight games without a steal. And it's like, oh no, the game before he had 5 steals against Cincinnati. And, we've talked before about the difference between, is this someone who gambles for steals versus is this someone who just generates turnovers out of nothing? Kingston Flemings just generates turnovers out of nothing. Like, he will strip you. He will jump a passing lane that you thought there was absolutely no way that he was going to be able to get through. He's so much fun, and he does, again, everything you could want a point guard to do, right? With Mikel Brown, I'm a little bit worried about the efficiency. That is not a problem for Kingston Flemings. With Darius Acuff, I think he's been much better defensively than I had feared. He's still nowhere near Kingston Flemings' level. Kingston Flemings is someone who there is no team in the league that could not use him, And especially for the Kings to have someone who, we talked before about my reservations, let's put it kindly, my reservations about the Davion Mitchell trade. Kingston Flemings is 3, maybe 4 inches taller. And he is, De'Aaron Fox, when he was on, was a really good point of attack defender. Kingston Flemings is on every single play, every single possession. And again, he just turned 19, right? He's not a younger freshman, but he's still a teenager and he's doing all of these things. And yeah, it's really hard to find a flaw with Kingston Flemings, and what he does well, the Kings need so desperately. Now, he's not quite the same level of playmaker for others as either Mikel Brown or Darius Acuff, but he's still fantastic at it. And the defensive gap between Kingston Flemings and any guard in this class not named Darryn Peterson is dramatic. So if the Kings happen to end up with the 5th pick and they essentially had their pick of the litter of the available guards, I would take Kingston Flemings for them and not think about it twice.
Wow, what a year for point guards! Yeah,
seriously,
unusual in a very good way. Next up, Christopher Klein mocked Jayden Quaintance, I believe you say his name.
Yeah,
Jayden Quaintance at 6 for the Kings.
So we talked about this offline. There, as you mentioned up front, there were 8 players who were mocked to the Kings in this exercise, and we've talked about 5 of them, and we've got 3 more on the. No, we've talked about. Can I do math? Quaintance.
We have, including Quaintance, we have 3.
Don't we have 1, 2? Yeah. Sorry, bad math. Anyway, Quaintance was the most surprising for me on this list, and that is not any sort of knock against Quaintance. I have him higher on my board than Mikel Brown at the moment. So it's not like this isn't a reasonable range for him. There are a few people, I'm not among this group, but there are a few people who think that Quaintance has started to solidify himself as the number 5 prospect in this draft. And the reasoning behind Quaintance is very, very simple. And it's the same reason why, and for those of you who want to go back into the archive, you can find the episode that we did with Fran Fraschilla ahead of the draft before this past one of why I had Alex Sarr at number 1 on my board in that class, which is Jayden Quaintance has the potential to be a Defensive Player of the Year candidate, Defensive Player of the Year winner. He is sensationally athletic. He is, also actually a really underrated passer for a big man, which is something that I'm starting to care about more and more as time goes on, of just, can you make those interior passes? Some of you may be familiar with him from last year at Arizona State when he was a 17-year-old freshman and still was one of the best defensive players in the country. He's had a very rough injury-plagued sort of year for Kentucky, which, he sat out most of the start of the season, came back for a few games in December and early January, and is now out again. So he also, was clearly being worked back from injury. So if you look at the raw box score numbers, you're not going to be impressed. But he's also playing like just over 15 minutes a game, which is why those numbers look as low as they do. Now, there are some concerns with Quaintance, which is, again, why I have him slightly lower than where he's projected here at 6, which is he really does not have much offensive touch at all. He shot 48% from the free throw line last year. I'm not really even counting his percentage at the line this year. He's shooting 30%, but it's 4 for 13. Like, he's barely gotten to the line at all. Last year, he had 71 free throw attempts, and he shot 48%, right? Less than half of his free throws. That's not something that you want to see. And, again, the sample size of this year is obviously tiny, but he took 32 threes last year, hit 18% of them, 6 for 32. He's taken 0 threes so far in limited minutes this year. There is no stretch to his offensive game. Additionally, he's not as good around the basket as either his athleticism or his size or his shot diet would portend. Like, he shot 53% last year, and again, that was dragged down by the 6 of 32 from 3-point range, but even still, he's not someone who you're going to be relying on to do much of anything other than make good passes from the dunker spot offensively. And again, he's the kind of athlete where it's weird for me that his profile around the rim is not better in terms of the offensive stuff. But again, defensively, like, this guy is a defensive player of the year candidate. And so then the question just becomes, how much can you compensate for the offensive holes with this guy? And if he weren't as good of a passer as he is, I would be a lot more worried about the offensive profile. I'm still worried. Like, I don't want to, belabor the point here, but he's so special defensively that some team is going to take a chance on him really high in the draft, and it's going to be deserved. I'm not sure that team is the Kings, because until recently, they were the worst offense in the NBA with, on the decline phase of their careers, but a couple of Hall of Famers and an all-star on top of that who are very offensively tilted players, right? So the offense was supposed to be much better for the Kings this year than it's been, and instead it's been a disaster. And quite frankly, I don't think it makes sense for the Kings to take Quaintance at 6 when they already have Reynaud and Cardwell, right? And I don't mean, there's a discussion of fit, which I think I fall in a very weird place with in terms of the draft community, where I'm starting to wonder if fit is more important than people think it is, for the sole reason of what you and I have talked about with Keegan Murray for years and years and years and years of, it doesn't matter how much he's the best player available if he gets to your team and doesn't get the developmental opportunities that he needs. And to be clear, Quaintance is a much higher profile player than Reynaud or Cardwell, and if he were on the Kings, I would expect that he would get a significant percentage of Cardwell's minutes, and that wouldn't be a bad developmental notion. But with this particular draft class and with the particular problems that the Kings have, if they're deciding we're trading everybody but Sabonis and we're just going to try and find a big who fits with him, in theory, Jayden Quaintance is an excellent fit alongside Domantas Sabonis, especially if Sabonis continues to be more and more willing to shoot from distance like he has been over the last couple of seasons. But the value proposition of passing up on a guard to take Quaintance here at 6, I just think the Kings need a point guard so much more desperately than they need a defensive center right now. And so, for Christopher Klein or for anybody else who's considering things from the Kings' perspective, this is not a knock on Jayden Quaintance as a prospect at all. I do genuinely believe that he has Defensive Player of the Year potential. I just don't know if it's the best use of the incredibly valuable pick that the Kings have to select someone who doesn't fill either a forward or guard spot.
Makes sense. Makes total sense. Okay, so moving along, Brian Kelbrowski took or mocked Cam Boozer at 3.
Yeah, NBA Draft.net also had Cam Boozer at 3. And for those of you who are more draft Knicks as opposed to Kings fans who have gotten to this point in the podcast, you're probably wondering, why are we waiting so long to talk about Cam Boozer and Darryn Peterson? Because we've mentioned the top 3 time and time again throughout this podcast, and here we are. Our final 2 players are that top 3. And I have Cam Boozer at 2. I strongly considered, before Darryn Peterson returned from his most recent injury, I strongly considered bumping Boozer all the way up to number 1. And that's because he has been almost unprecedentedly good this season. Like, at one point he was on track to shatter the box plus minus record for a college player, doing it as a freshman. And not only as a freshman, he is one of the youngest players in this class. He will not turn 19, until after he's drafted. So he will be 19 before his first NBA season begins, but he will not turn 19 until after draft night. And I mean, you look at the box score, basic box score stuff, and it tells you one thing: 24 points a game, 10 rebounds a game, 4 assists per game, 2 steals per game, 0.7 blocks per game. It's like no box score category that he doesn't fill. And then you watch the guy play. And here's the thing with watching Cam Boozer, which I have had the opportunity I saw him live at the same Hoop Summit game that I mentioned earlier in terms of Darius Acuff. And the thing about Cam Boozer is you hear that stat line and you think, oh, okay, so this guy just does everything. But if you are a Cam Boozer skeptic, what I would like you to do as a Cam Boozer skeptic, those of you out there who are listening in the audience, find a bad scoring night from Cam Boozer. Find a night where his shots just aren't hitting. And, the thing with Cam Boozer is I'm struggling to come up with any player who I've evaluated whose bad nights are better than Cam Boozer's bad nights. He could have a game where he has 4 points on 2 for 13 shooting, and he'll have 16 rebounds and 9 assists and 4 steals, and he'll be the one leading the defensive coverage, calling out plays, and he'll just, like the Hoop Summit game that I saw of him, he was the best player on the floor, but he didn't really start shooting that much until the second half. And he ended up leading the game in scoring with 22 points on 8 for 15 shooting, 2 of 4 threes, 4 or 5 from the free throw line. He had 16 rebounds and 6 assists to go along with 3 steals. And that was the part that stood out of like, oh, in the first half when his shots weren't going down, his imprint was still over every single part of the game. Now, here's the interesting part for me is, I still have him at number 2. I ended up deciding against bumping him up to number 1. And the thing with Cam Boozer that's very interesting is if you look at it one way, he's an undersized center. He's 6'9". He's, put it this way, he has proven himself as a shooter this year. That was much more in question heading into the season than, the 38% on decently healthy volume from 3-point range that he's put up this year. That was sort of the big line concern. But the other concern was, is this guy an undersized center? Here's the thing with Cam Boozer. Cam Boozer is built like a brick house. He's listed at 250. All of that is muscle. Seeing him in person at Nike Hoop Summit, it was like, what is this 25-year-old doing out here? And then you realize, oh no, he's actually one of the youngest guys here. Right? It's like, it is absurd. The raw strength that he has at his age is incredibly uncommon. And that allows him to do all of those things that I was talking about of, you run the offense through him in the post, he's going to back his guy down. And if he's not double teamed, then he's going to just destroy that guy and get his way to the rim. If he is double teamed, when I was talking earlier about Darius Acuff and I said he's probably the second best passer in the class, I was thinking of Christian Anderson, who I think is the best passer in this class. And I revised my thoughts on Darius Acuff because Cam Boozer is such a good passer that he might actually be the second best passer in the class as a big. Now, here's the interesting part for me is, of the top 3, Cam Boozer is the weirdest fit for the Kings. Now, here's the thing. With the top 3, I don't think it matters. Like, I think all 3 of those guys are so good that if the pick ends up being Kings are the 3rd pick, and, it's Darryn 1, AJ 2, or AJ 1, Darryn 2, whatever. And it's like, the Kings are on the board, and the question is, do we go with Cam Boozer, who's a bit of a clunkier fit alongside the bigs we have, and is much more of a big than someone who's going to be playing a lot of 4? I love Caleb Wilson as a prospect. I want to be very, very clear. I am a huge Caleb Wilson believer as a prospect. If they're both on the board and you're the 3rd pick for the Kings, you take Cam Boozer and you don't think about it twice. It's hard for me to convey just how many of the little things Cam Boozer does right. And you look at the box score and you say, wait, so he's averaging 20, 23, 10, 4, and 2, and you're talking about everything he does that doesn't show up on the stat sheet? Correct. I'm talking about everything that does not show up on the stat sheet. He sets absolutely pulverizing screens. He can pick and pop. He can pick and roll. He can handle. He can make passes out of the short roll. He is an absolute force to deal with on the glass on either end. Unlike a lot of young big men who I'm worried about getting shoved out of position a lot, that's not going to be a problem for Cam Boozer. He is the one who shoves, right? That's the deal with, he's got just one of the most insane bases of any 17-year-old I've ever watched playing basketball. And he was 17 when I saw him at Hoop Summit, right? It's funny because this is a theme, and it's going to get even worse when we get to the next guy, who's the guy I have at number 1 in this class. But I don't think I can say enough about what Cam Boozer does when the first option for him isn't working and the second option for him isn't working. And I'm not as much of an 82 game versus 16 game person in terms of sort of the distinction between the two. To be clear, there is a distinction between the two. I'm not saying that there isn't. I don't think the gap is as large as some people think it is. But when you're talking about the 16 game player, I always go back to the Bob Myers interview where he's like, it doesn't matter what the thing you do best is in the playoffs because you're not going to get to do that. It doesn't matter what you're second best at in the playoffs because you're not going to get to do that either. With the exception of the guy that we're about to talk about, I could count on one hand the number of people who I'm more confident in what is the thing you're third best at than Cam Boozer. Like, if you shut him down as an at-rim finisher and as a passer, he's still shooting 38% on threes. And I don't think he's quite that level of a shooter. I think that's more of a small sample size thing than anything else. But, he's still got great touch, right? He's 75% of the free throw line on a larger sample size, which, to me is more solid evidence that he's, not elite in terms of shooting, but he's a good shooter, period, as opposed to just a good shooter for a 6'9", 6'10" power forward / center type, right? And, with Cam, again, it's similar to AJ in that he will need someone who can do more of the rim protecting stuff. And he's nowhere near as mobile as AJ, but very few people are as good laterally as AJ Dybantsa, and it's not a knock against Cam Boozer to say he's not that. The thing I just keep coming back to again and again and again and again with Cam Boozer is, even if I think he's the weirdest to fit in among the top 3 for the Kings specifically, he's also the kind of player who makes that stuff not matter because he just figures it out. It's like, okay, coach, what do you need me to do today? If you list everything, there, like, other than shot blocking, there isn't a box that Cam Boozer doesn't check, right? And so it's like, okay, what do we need tonight, coach? Oh, Sabonis is out. Great, I'm going to get 17 rebounds. Oh, Sabonis is playing. Great, I'm going to go 4 for 10 for 3-point range. I'm just going to, I'm going to be the pop option, and Sabonis is going to make kickouts out of the post, and I'm going to hit those shots. Again, it's like, even though it's less clean to imagine, it's hard for me to think of a Cam Boozer fit that isn't clean, in the sense that whatever is not clean, he will make it work. He will figure it out.
I realize it's not the same player and not the same style of play, but one of the things that you just said made me think there's one player in the league right now who he decides, what is it that you need tonight? And I'm going to give you that at a level that no one else in the league can produce. It doesn't matter what it is. That's what I'm going to give you. And, of course, that's the Joker. And how often do we see a player like that? It's hard to remember the last time we saw a player who said, oh, tonight you don't need any scoring? Okay, I'm going to give you 28 rebounds and 19 assists. Oh, tonight you need points? I'll go for 60. How's that sound? So I realize they're not the same type of player, but in that particular element that you're talking about, where what is it that you need tonight? Okay, done.
Yeah, and they are quite different as players, but it is funny to me that the one thing that maybe both of them would potentially struggle with is the shot blocking stuff, which is weird because they're bigs. But yeah, it's a very, no one should be compared to Jokic for the sake of their own sanity and the sake of trying to make reasonable expectations for these poor teenagers. But
But I couldn't help but think of that when you said that.
Well, yeah, and that's, again, part of what I was saying earlier and it's funny because the guy we're about to talk about is very easy to do this with, whereas the other, honestly, I want to talk about the top 4 with this because Caleb Wilson is a tier below the top 3, but it's also a very similar discussion in terms of there isn't really a clean comparison because players with this kind of skill set were not developed until very recently, right? Like Cam Boozer would not have had the ball in his hands anywhere near enough to become the Cam Boozer that he is today if this were 20 years ago, right? Like Kevin Garnett intentionally listed himself as under 7 feet when, you ask him anytime after he stopped playing, it's like, yeah, I'm 7'1". He would say 6'13", right? It's like, but that was, essentially because, hey, if you're listed at that height, you don't ever get to touch the ball, right? And Kevin Durant started his career as a shooting guard, and I think part of that is, I would be surprised if Kevin Durant did not have a growth spurt while he was in Seattle, because, I believe that he was 6'9" coming out of Texas. You see any of the pictures of him standing next to guys who are listed much taller since then, it's like, there's no way Kevin Durant is like, I love the picture of Kevin Durant. There's a Team USA picture where Kevin Durant is standing next to DeMarcus Cousins. It's like, one of these guys is listed at 6'9", and one of these guys is listed at 6'11", and the guy who's 2 inches taller is the guy who's listed at 6'9", right? So, that's the kind of thing where I think part of the reason it's difficult to find a comp that makes any sense for these guys is like the way that I can think of to describe Cam Boozer in terms of this kind of thing is like, I have to make a Frankenstein's monster, right? It's Draymond Green's passing and handle with like Evan Mobley's fluidity as a shooter with like, again, see, it's like, I have to come up with, like, I have to find the different, and it's like, he's not anywhere near Draymond's level of defensive IQ, but he's pretty darn close. No one is. That's the point, right? Yeah. Cam Boozer is the first person who I've said Draymond's green in comparison to for a prospect in a very long time, because I think it is malpractice to compare these guys to one of, if not the smartest defensive player who's ever lived, right? It's unfair to put people on that level, but in terms of like a undersized big who can make absolutely every single pass, like he's not quite Jokic level as a passer, but he's absolutely Draymond Green level as a passer. And that's, the Warriors don't work without Draymond Green being the player that he is. And Draymond Green couldn't hold Cam Boozer's jock as a scorer. No chance. Like, Draymond Green did not shoot, did not score. That was not what he did. And that was fine. That wasn't what he needed them. That's not what the Warriors needed him to do. But it's like, if I'm comparing Cam Boozer to Draymond Green, it's like, well, they're not on the same level defensively, and that says absolutely nothing about Cam Boozer whatsoever. They're also not on the same level offensively, and that says absolutely nothing about Draymond Green whatsoever, right? Because, like, okay, we're comparing a guy who's been close to or leading the NCAA in scoring as an 18-year-old freshman, but also he's just got this absurdly gifted ability to read the floor and make those kinds of passes. And it's not quite Jokic, obviously. Again, similar to Draymond Green defensively, no one has ever been Nikola Jokic as a passer, but you have to cobble things together, because these guys are going to be the templates going forward for, this is an undersized big, but he's an exceptionally gifted passer, and man, can he score. And he's got he's not Kevin Durant in terms of like pulling up off the dribble, but he can shoot too, right? It's like, for those people who have been following my draft coverage for a while, the best comp that I can make after all of this equivocating is like richest man on earth's Darron Holmes. And those of you who are familiar with my draft coverage know how much I adored Darron Holmes as a prospect and still think he can be a very, very, very good NBA player. But it's like, that's what I have to reach for, is like, hey, this guy who I had 12th on my board and who I think is going to be a really good player, like multiply all of that by 10 and you get Cam Boozer, and no one else has a similar enough profile that I could even think of who it would be.
Well, we are down to our final player, and we've mentioned him a number of times tonight. And a Hornets person on Reddit, on NBA Reddit, picked Darryn Peterson mocked him number 1 to the Kings.
Yeah, the reason that we haven't talked about Darryn Peterson yet is because the Kings, being the Kings, won none of the Tankathon Sims, and so because they didn't win any of the Tankathon Sims, they didn't get the chance to draft Darryn Peterson number 1 overall. The comparison thing that I mentioned earlier is, this is where this comes into play with Darryn Peterson, because unlike AJ, who, he's in the Rudy Gay mold, I guess. I should have thought of that name as a comparison when we were talking about AJ, but he's so many levels above Rudy Gay that it almost didn't bear mentioning as a potential comp. Cam Boozer, it's like, again, either it's that version of Deron Holmes, or it's like sort of Pascal Siakam, but also not in, some pretty clear athleticism ways that make that kind of weird. But Darryn Peterson is much easier to make a comp of. Pick your favorite shooting guard of all time. There you go.
Do it.
Right? It's like, he's in the Michael Jordan, the, Kobe Bryant, the Brandon Roy. I'm trying to pick someone who's not, either considered one of the best or the best of all time, or like, but here's the thing with Darryn Peterson is he's so good that those comparisons aren't unfair. Like that's, and it's funny because you actually got to see Darryn Peterson live before I did, because you got a chance to watch him in high school, and he did not end up going to Hoop Summit. So I didn't get a chance to see him there. There is one, and I mean one, reason that Darryn Peterson does not end up a Hall of Fame player, and that's if he gets hurt. And that is even more than how sensational Cam Boozer has been. The only reason that I considered moving Darryn Peterson off number 1 on my board is concern about, is injury going to be a problem? And it's the kind of thing where I don't know what to do with it, because he's had a couple of minor nagging injuries that are the kind of thing that make you concerned about, oh no, is this going to be a chronic injury guy going forward? But like, he didn't really have much in the way of injury problems in high school. Like, he was relatively healthy throughout his high school career. And I really don't want to be worried about Darryn Peterson because he's had a couple of minor injuries at Kansas. When he has played basketball this year, he has been everything that you could have hoped for and more. He had one bad game, and the internet being the internet, like, Kansas fans got all on his case because he had one bad game. And then he followed up, that one vaguely questionable game with, oh, yeah, okay, so I'm just going to put up 23 and 32 in back-to-back games, and I'm going to do it on incredible efficiency. I'm going to knock down 21 of my 23 free throws. I'm going to, be in the 30s from 3-point range. I'm going to make basically no mistakes with the ball in my hands. Again, it's like Darryn Peterson is so much easier than these other guys to talk about in terms of comparisons, because I could argue that we haven't really seen Cam Boozer before. I could argue that we've had players of AJ Dybantsa's archetype before, but not quite in the same way. Like, the more I talk about it, the more I think AJ Dybantsa might actually just be this generation's version of Bernard King, but he's got the potential to be so much better defensively than Bernard King ever was that I don't know about that one. Again, Darryn Peterson is easy. He is your like built-in a lab 2 guard. And, again, it's like the questions are, he's not quite a primary point guard level of passer. I don't care. Again, and I want to get to your descriptions in a minute. And the reason I'm not talking about some of this stuff is because I want to give you the chance to talk about Darryn, because you saw him live before I did. But man, I mean, again, it's just like the model of what do you want your 2 guard to be? Like, any of those things Darryn Peterson can and will do at a high level, and doing it while just being among the most clear elements ever of, I remember this vividly when, we were at Hoop Summit, the No Ceilings crew, and long story short, there was a period where I was in the Airbnb by myself, and I just turned on Darryn Peterson highlights, and it's like, okay, he's the guy at the top of the class who's not here, right? And so I'm trying to remember because there were 2 games that we watched. I'm trying to remember which of the one it was. There was one that was against AJ Dybantsa's AAU team, and I think the other was it was either Cam Boozer or Caleb Wilson, but like someone who was near the top of that high school class. And I watched for like 2 minutes before I was like, "Oh my god, this guy's the best player on the floor," and it's not. It should be closer, but it's not. So right, I've given a lot of the subjective stuff and also not given some of the subjective stuff very intentionally because I wanted to give you an opening to talk about it before I talked about everything.
About Darryn?
Yeah.
You said that you didn't mention, you were leaving it to me to say what I said at the time. I don't fully remember it. I'm going to take a stab at it, but then you can correct it and deal with it. I think I said that what impressed me about him was that he was totally in control of himself, but also totally in control of the game. And that's just an incredible combination to me. I probably said it a lot better then. I'm doing it from memory now. But that's what stood out to me. And remember, I wasn't there to scout him. I was there to watch a full day of stuff, just not really scouting anybody, but it didn't matter. You couldn't help it, right? He leaped off the floor at you in terms of, but that's my memory of what I said. You can tell me better what I said.
Well, you and I have talked before about how your memory is much, much, much better than mine. And the way I remember it is basically the way that you said it. So, that's probably basically what it was. But the way I remember you saying it is that he was in complete control of himself and complete command of the game. And that you couldn't remember having scouted a high school guard who was as smooth as he was or made things look as easy as he did. Yeah. And that last point is the part that I really didn't want to step over in my Darryn Peterson discussion is there is not a single possession when you're watching Darryn Peterson play basketball where you're thinking, this guy's sped up, this guy's nervous, this guy, no. He, it's one of those things where like, and it's funny because, you are well aware of how much more I've been talking about baseball in the last 2 years than I had when we started doing this podcast. And so I'm going to keep the baseball brief because I know I've already overstayed my welcome on that front. But to me, it was the difference between Andruw Jones, who was recently elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame, and Jim Edmonds. Jim Edmonds would make like 15 diving catches a year. But if you watch Jim Edmonds play, which I did a decent amount because the 2 baseball teams that I watch are the Yankees and the Reds. And obviously, Jim Edmonds playing for the Cardinals, I saw a lot of Jim Edmonds. And the thing with Jim Edmonds is he would slow down a little bit so that he would be far enough away from the ball that he'd make a diving catch. Whereas Andruw Jones would get to balls that Jim Edmonds would never in a million years have a chance to get to. And he would just make it look like he was running under a routine pop fly. Like, that is the thing with Darryn Peterson is basically anything that can look difficult for a guard to do, he makes it look routine. It's like, and we can, give the top line numbers because I haven't yet, but, 21.5 points per game, just under 5 rebounds a game, just under 2 assists per game, about a steal and a block per game, 49, 42, 82 shooting splits. Not bad. Pretty solid. Positive assist to turnover ratio, not that much, but again, it's like I was hopeful heading into the year that he could show more point guard stuff. I'm much less concerned about that now because it's like, okay, that's not who he is. It still doesn't matter. It still doesn't make any difference. You want him to have the ball in his hands all the time because, even if he's not this highlight reel passer, he's still going to be able to make a shot for himself on like 99 possessions out of 100. That's going to be better than anything you're going to get with anybody else running the offense. I don't think I can say enough about how great, truly great, I think Darryn Peterson is going to be as an NBA player. And, from the Kings perspective, yeah, okay, he's another shooting guard. I don't care. I don't care that he's another shooting guard type. It's, for me, with Darryn Peterson, it's not quite the same. I don't want to overstate the case, but it's a very similar thing to me of the famous, repeated to death Bob Knight thing of, being asked who the team should draft at number 2. It's like, take Michael Jordan, but we need a center. Then play Michael Jordan at center, right? Like, I wouldn't say play Darryn Peterson at center, but it's a very similar thing to where if Cam Boozer were doing what he's done this year in comparison to literally anyone else I've scouted besides Victor Wembanyama, Cam Boozer would be the number one player on my board right now. If Cam Boozer were doing what he had done, if he were doing what he'd done against Cooper Flagg, like if that was, and obviously that's weird because, hey, if Cooper Flagg had been in his original draft class, he would have been in this year's draft class, and then they would have been playing on top of each other, right? Alternatively, I think it's entirely possible if Cam Boozer and Cooper Flagg were on the same Duke team, especially if Concadipple was on that Duke team too, they wouldn't lose the game. They win every game by like 47 points. But, the idea there being maybe Cooper, but I don't think so. I mean, I think Cooper for me would go number 2 in this class. He would still be behind Darryn Peterson. That's how much I believe in Darryn Peterson as an NBA player. Again, it's just injuries. That's it. That's the only and again, all of this stuff is opinion, right? There's a reason that every single year all the teams and all the public evaluators and all the consultants working for teams and whatever, and everybody tries to put together the best board they can, and every single year someone's a bust and someone surprises, and
I disagree with that. The consultants working for the teams don't try to put, or at least the people who are public faced for the teams don't try to put together the best board because they want to trick the other teams into who they're going to take.
Okay, fair caveat, but the point that I'm trying to make, which again, the idea here being like everybody gets it wrong every year. Even the people who are best at this get it wrong every year. I truly cannot think of what is the use case for Darryn Peterson doesn't work other than he gets hurt. And, I said the same thing about Victor Wembanyama, right? And, unfortunately, there's more reason to be worried about injury for a 7'5" guy than a 6'5" guy, but it's the same deal, right? It's like, I don't see how Darryn Peterson doesn't work unless he gets hurt.
Yeah. I think one of the other things that would apply in his case, but more generally, as we've talked about, in terms of, and this is so complicated when you talk about best talent, fit, need, and all the other things, and how do you decide among them? And if someone is the right, you're convinced is the right pick, fit and need are of course important, but one of the factors that gets overlooked, I think, in the discussion a little bit is you can trade redundancy. It's like you're not stuck with the player that they're now better than that comes to the team that's a good player and can bring back value in a trade. You can trade redundancy. I guess I don't know if you want to speak to that at all.
No, absolutely. I mean, the way that I look at it is, even though the top 4 is basically, I would be surprised if it's not chalk at this point of, the top 3 goes in the order depending on, where teams have them. And then Caleb Wilson goes to whoever is at number 4, right? Like I said before, I'll say again, I would be stunned if the draft goes any way but that. But I think part of the difference between Caleb Wilson and the top 3 is with Caleb Wilson, it's like, depending on the team, he might be the one who's asked to adjust to make things work. With the top 3 guys, everybody else is fitting around them, right? It's like, if AJ Dybantsa overlaps with somebody, that's the guy getting traded, not AJ. If Darryn Peterson, there's like, we're happy with our 2 guard, but we don't really have a, ball handling, passing point guard type. There will be one of 2 ways that goes, which is either Darryn Peterson says, okay, I got you, coach, and then immediately turns into a point guard, or the coach says, hey, other guy, whoever other guy is, figure out the point guard stuff because Darryn Peterson is now our starting shooting guard, right? It's like, that is the caliber of player that we're talking about at the top of this draft class where, and most of the time, if you're picking in the top 5, you want the other players to work around that top 5 guy, right? But the developmental avenues thing that we talked about earlier with maybe Keegan Murray's offense would have developed more robustly had he gotten more opportunities with the ball in his hands. This is going to be a situation where you're not prioritizing getting the ball to Zach LaVine over Darryn Peterson. Period.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're doing that, then the Kings are even worse off than I think they are. And I don't think the Kings are that bad off.
The question would be, to what end?
Yes. 100%.
Yeah. Well, unless you have anything to add, I'm going to just add thank you for educating us on the players that have been mocked to the Kings. That, again, we don't know what their draft position is going to be. We know we don't know, but we have a very strong sense of what their record is going to look like and where that places them pre-lottery. We don't know what's going to happen in the lottery, where they're going to go. We've seen some very strange things happen in the last few years, which will go a long way towards determining who they're in a position to get. But now we know, and we'll know more, obviously, as the season unfolds, about who they should be looking at, depending on how the lottery turns out.
So, first of all, thank you. That's very kind. As you well know and pointed out early on in the podcast, if you just gave me free run to talk about this, we would still be here when the Kings were on the clock for selecting the pick. So I appreciate you putting up with me for, going on my draft rambles for as long as I have. There is one thing that I want to say very quickly before we close, which is we have talked about 8 players here today. Assuming the Kings are in a similar position to where they are right now with, are they third or fourth worst record in the NBA right now? I don't have I should have Basketball Reference up to confirm this for me, but stand by. Yeah. Okay. So as of right now, the Kings have the 4th worst record in the association, which, assuming that all holds, the lowest that the team with the 4th worst record could select is, in fact, 8th. If every single team in the top 4 jumps every single team with the 4 worst records, theoretically, the lowest that the Kings could pick is 8th. That would be, I talked about how I'm not quite as sure of Jayden Quaintance's fit with the Kings necessarily. He would still be a great get for them at 8, assuming 5, 6, and 7 are Mikel Brown, Darius Acuff, Kingston Flemings in some order. I would honestly take Labaron Philon, who's a guard out of Alabama, who's ridiculous at getting to the rim and also sensational defensively. If I were making a King-specific board, I would put him ahead of Jayden Quaintance. If we're talking about the 7 players we talked about today, plus Labaron Philon, plus Jayden Quaintance, if you're a Jayden Quaintance guy, right? Why not? Any one of those 8 players would dramatically improve the Kings in the short term, in the medium term, and in the long term. So,
and they've got the players to build around with the. I'm not reluctant to call their acquisition of rookies this year spectacular. I mean, none of them are spectacular players, but given that the fact that they only had one pick at 42, to get the 3 players they had, 2 with draft choices and 1 as an undrafted free agent, and they've got Keon. I mean, who knows who they're going to keep? We don't know that, but in theory, they've got Keon Ellis, they've got Keegan, maybe Monk, plus those 3 rookies, plus somebody who might be the best player in the draft. There's reasons for optimism. I know Kings fans don't like to hear that because they always have the rug pulled out from under them for one reason or another, and that's been going on since time immemorial. But I would say they've got a great start with the rookie class that they have, and in addition to that, it doesn't just speak to the quality of those players in terms of how they play, but it also speaks to the talent evaluation that the front office did in acquiring.
Yeah, and just to put a nice bow on everything before we, officially wrap up the show, the 3 rookies that the Kings got this year are what they got with those assets that you mentioned of the 42nd pick, right? If that's what the Kings front office has shown, small sample size short, but early results extremely positive for the talent evaluation in the draft. Now they're, not necessarily pick of the litter, but they're pretty close to pick of the litter. If they can do what they did with the resources that they had, it's going to be, I'm very excited to see where the Kings end up because, again, assuming they're in a similar position record-wise to where they are right now, it will be very, very difficult for them to go wrong with the quality of the top three and the quality of the point guards outside of the top three.
Well, with the value of the players that are likely to be traded having sunk so low, they're not, for trade purposes, they're not likely to be bringing in players for the rest of this season and going forward, but particularly for this season, that are going to be positives toward improving the record. I mean, who's going to trade any player like that for what the Kings have to offer? No one.
Yeah. No, this is not, all jokes that may have been made during the Kings 4-game winning streak aside, this is not a team that's going to be challenging for the play-in. And whatever trades they make, even the most win now possible trade, nobody else is going to sell the asset that they would need to get them to that point. And so the odds of them being outside of the top 8 on draft night is
0.
Vanishingly small. And given that there are 8 players plus, depending on how you feel about Quaintance, 9 players who the Kings are pretty much guaranteed to get one of those 9, all 9 of them would be huge gets. And
very, very likely to get someone in the top half of those.
Yes.
Right? I mean, weird things happen, and they could happen again. There's no guarantees, but at least statistically, that's unlikely.
Put it this way, if the Kings go into the commercial break on lottery night and their name has not been called yet, indicating that they made it into the top 4, Kings fans should be shouting from the rooftops because this top 4, I think, they're all going to be great. And the top 3 in particular is historic, and not only historic, but only one of those guys doesn't directly plug into a role and position of extreme need for the Kings in particular.
Good point. Well, thanks again for educating us, Nick. Much appreciated, and I'm sure the fans will appreciate it as much as I did. So,
well, thank you for saying that. And as you well know, I will ramble about the NBA draft for as long as anyone is willing to listen. So hopefully for you at home, that is for the full length of the show. So that will do it for us for this week. Thank you all so much for tuning in. If you've been enjoying the show, please take the time to subscribe and leave a rating and or a review in whatever podcast player you might be using. If you are listening to the whole shebang up on YouTube, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, throw a like our way, all of those things that help people like us continue to make the things that we enjoy making. If you want to reach out to us, follow us on social media at Kings Weekly Pod on Twitter, at Kings Weekly Podcast on Blue Sky. You can find Ray on Twitter at Ray LeBove. You can find me at NBA Johnson. And if you have any feedback regarding the show, feel free to reach out to us via email, kingsweeklypodcast@gmail.com. And as always, thanks so much for listening.
Thanks, everyone.